Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Watercolor Hour. Today we're going to be painting a fox in the snow. Alright, so let's go over everything that's in your kit. You should have, let's see, 5 shades of paint. You should have a baggie of table salt, a copy of the finished painting, a copy of the reference photo, a half sheet of watercolor paper, and a scrap for testing colors, and you should have this outline. You should also have a round brush and a detail brush. So before we get started, you're going to want to grab some water for rinsing your brush, as well as a paper towel, and a palette would be helpful. I'm going to use this one. Okay, so I'm going to test out our colors first. And then I'm going to go over the tracing, because it is a little bit different this month. So we have our burnt sienna, our burnt umber, and I think we used some of these colors last month. Light oxide red, this pretty blue color, and our Payne's Gray. So we're going to be using mixes of these shades to do our painting. I'm going to set this aside for now, and we'll come back to it. So here is the image that we'll be tracing. You'll notice it's not just lines this month. There are some sort of dashes and dots, so it probably looks a little strange. The reason for that is because we're not going to be painting the entire fox. We want to leave some of the areas not completely white, but lighter. So these are areas that we want to avoid. They also, all these lines also correspond with areas that are darker. So these were just to remind me that certain spaces were darker. So this here, as well as on top of the head, around the eye area, and then here. So hopefully that will make a little bit more sense as we go along. But for now, if you want to trace it this way, you don't have to do the dashes. That just helps me to know that that's not going to be a solid line. That's more, this is an area that's going to be kind of blended out to a different value. So the next thing we're going to do is start mixing our colors. So we're going to start with a light reddish color and then move up to a darker shade. So I've just started working on my colors here. And for this one on the right, you're going to want to add some water to your palette. And then you're going to add some of the light oxide red. So that's what this is. And so that's pretty light. If you take the light oxide red straight from here without any water, or with very little water, you can see how this is a very opaque color. So you're going to water that down pretty heavily. Later on we'll use more paint, but for now we just want it light. And then you want to mix a reddish brown. So for this one, again, you're going to make a little puddle of water there, and then you're going to mix your burnt umber and burnt sienna. And then if it's too brown, you can add a little bit of the light oxide red. You just want to be careful because that color is one that tends to take over the shade, so you don't want to add too much of it. So we've got a light reddish brown. So for now, we're going to use that, as well as a little bit of watered down Payne's Gray for the tail. So this is not too dark. That's a very light gray. Okay, so it may be helpful to get a separate cup of water, because we are going to be adding some water to the page and we don't want it to look muddy. But I've got just a giant bowl of water, so I'm just going to use that one. So I did take some progress photos, so I'm going to follow that while I'm working. And if you find that that is something that you think would be helpful, you can email me and I'll send those to you in a PDF. It was just, I think there are 10 photos here, so it was going to be too much printing for me to include in the kits. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to be doing is working on, let's see, this back area here as well as the tail. I'm going to work in stages so that the colors for each section look distinct and they're not all blurring together. Alright, so I'm just going to get this wet. I'm going to start here. I'm not going to get these sections that are supposed to be lighter wet, so just keep that in mind. And hopefully you can see the paper is kind of shiny where the water goes on. And I'm going to be getting this area in here wet. So just going to that dotted line. Okay, so I'm going to leave this alone and work on the tail. So I'm just going to add water to the tail. Okay, so hopefully you can see these areas where it's shiny and the areas here that I've left alone. So I'm going to be adding this light reddish shade all over the areas that are wet. And the water just helps it blend and not look too dark. Because we want these certain areas to be lighter, it's a little bit easier to blend when the paint is watered down. And the tail. Okay, so now I'm going to rinse my brush off, and all it has is water on it now, and I'm just going to dab some of the water off on my paper towel. I don't want this soaking wet, because if you add it here, if you touch your brush to the paper and it's got a ton of water, it's just going to spread the paint everywhere. So I'm just softening those lines. So I just touch the brush to this area here and kind of work it. If the paint gets in this section, it's not a huge deal, so this little sort of triangle, because that's going to be darker later on. I just don't want it to bleed too much into the areas that are going to be lighter. And then I'm going to add, I'm going to use my small brush and grab some of the watered down gray and add it to the tail, and I'm just running it along the edge. It's a little light, so I'm going to grab some from the card here. And you can see that it's very dark. I'm going to grab some more, and what I'm going to do is work on the fur. So I'm just going to take my brush, and it's easier to do this if your brush is at this angle, so a 90-degree angle, just straight up and down. And I'm just kind of dragging the paint from here out. Just so it's a little bit fuzzy. And I'm going to grab some of this here and do that on this side. That's not dark enough, so I'm going to get some of the light oxide red on my brush. So we're just making the tail look little bit bushy. Okay, so rinse my brush off. And I'm going to make this back area a little bit darker. The paper's still wet, but it's not soaking wet. So what I'm going to do is add some water to my brush and grab some of the light oxide red. And you can see the paper's still wet because it's spreading. And I just want to make this darker. And I'm going to grab my small brush and drag some of that out. And when you're doing this, you want to go, it doesn't have to all be going in the same direction. They're fuzzy and their fur kind of goes different ways. So some of it could be coming out, going in a different way. The next thing we're going to be working on is the face. Well, this area here, and the top of the head, we're going to leave this section here lighter. So this ear and the top of the head, as well as the edges of the ears, are pretty dark. So we just have to be careful with our amounts of water and everything. So this isn't completely dry. So I'm going to wait for that to dry just a couple minutes, and then I'm going to start working on this section. Okay, so this part is mostly dry. It's dry enough, so I'm going to start working on this section. So I'm going to be getting part of the face wet. Just this section here. So the little dotted area here, I'm going to get wet. I'm not getting this ear wet or this little section, the edges of this ear wet either, because that has to be pretty dark. So I don't really need it watered down. So I'm just working around the ears and then stopping at this point here where this dotted line is. And going down to the nose. So I'll lift it up to see. Hopefully it'll be more visible. So hopefully you can see where it's shiny. So that is all that's wet. And you can see the ears are still dry, as well as this section here. Right, so I'm going to be using this watered down red color. And just moving it around the wet area. Right now I'm going to work on the ears. So for the ears, I'm going to do a mix of burnt umber and Payne's Gray, and I'm just going to grab it directly from here and add it to the paper. So I am leaving this little section on this side blank, so I'm not adding paint there. So you can see this is pretty dark. And I'm extending it over here around the edge. And then I'm going to add some of the Payne's Gray on top of that. So making it even darker. little bit escaped here, and I'm just drying my brush off and picking it up. Now for this area over here, because it's such a small section, I'm going to use my small brush to make this darker. So I've got my brown, and then I'm just dropping in some of the gray. I'll add some more over here too. Okay, so now I'm going to add some of the burnt sienna here. It was just looking a little bit too brown. So just dropping in some of the reddish color. Now I'm going to grab some of the light oxide red on this brush, and I'm going to add it here. So you can see that color is really dark. And what I'm doing is just darkening this little section up here. So you don't want too much paint. Grabbing some of my burnt sienna and just dropping it in there. And then we're going to do the same thing here that we did with the tail, where we just kind of drag some of the paint. And I'm going to grab a little bit of the light oxide red. And it's hard to see. I'll lift it up here. So here is the eye area, and there's a little line here. You can see it's a closed eyelid, and I'm just going to add a little bit of dark paint around this area here. So just a little spot of extra color, and then I'm going to rinse off my brush and move some of it around. So while this is still wet, I'm going to go ahead and darken the face. So I'm going to get my palette here, and let's see, I'm going to move this down. There we go. And put just a little bit of water, just a couple of drops, and then make a mix of the burnt sienna and burnt umber. So we end up with a dark reddish brown shade. Darker than that though. So just keep adding paint until it's a little more opaque. And so now I'm going to add that along here. So if you get too much paint, just dry your brush off and drag the paint that's on your paper around. So the paper should still be damp, so hopefully you're able to kind of move it around. We're just wanting to make the face darker. I'm going to grab a little bit of my red because it's looking a little bit too brown. A little bit outside of my line here, so I'm just going to soak that up. Add some darker paint up here. just outlining the head. My paper's starting to dry off over here, so I don't want to mess with it too much. So you just want to keep track of where that line was, the eyelid, so I'm just going around that, trying to avoid it. And now I'm going to get some water. Oops, did not rinse off my brush. And I'm going to work this little section here. I'm going to grab some of my reddish paint that I had earlier, which is the watered down light oxide red. And drop some of that in here. And this is one of those areas that is lighter on the bottom section, so I don't want to add too much paint. Plus this over here is still wet, so I'm just concentrating in this little corner here. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off and blend this. So you can just keep rinsing your brush off and add water to the paper. So I've got this section filled in here. Alright, so I'm going to wait for this to dry and then we're going to go back to this area and make it darker. Alright, so now I'm going to be working on darkening the body. I'm going to start by working up here and splashing water everywhere. I'm just going to get this little section here damp. I'm going to be working up here. I'm going to skip this section for now and then darken up the tail. I'm also going to darken up this area here, so you can distinguish the section from the face. So I'm just working directly on the paper, the watercolor card, so I'm grabbing some of the burnt sienna, burnt umber, and I just mix them up. They're all similar and they're all going to end up on the paper, so, but if you want, you can mix those two on your palette. And this is pretty dark. So it's blending, that's because the paper's wet. And I'm going to come all the way down in this little corner here. And if you need to use your small brush, you can. Make it a little bit easier to drag the paint in here. And now I'm going to do a mix of the burnt sienna and a little bit of the oxide red. I forgot to wet my paper. Alright, let me rinse my brush off. And I'm just going to wet this section here, connect it. Get the tail wet. And again, mix the burnt umber and burnt sienna. You just want a mix of brown and red. Doesn't have to be perfect. The paper's wet, so it'll all blend together. So now I'm gonna rinse my brush off and get some of the light oxide red and just add that in. And remember, that is a really opaque color, so you don't need very much of it. So there's some of the red. Grab these two browns. Fill in the tail. I'm going to grab some of the gray just directly from here with my wet brush. Alright, so we've got the tail filled in, and now I'm going to work on this little section here. And I'm going to use a little bit of the light oxide red. Just start filling this in. And you can use your small brush if you have trouble getting into these corners as well. I'm probably going to switch over. I'm going to add some of the burnt sienna because that was not quite dark enough. Alright, so this section is dark. And now, I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm going to come back to this. I should still have some watered down red left, and I'm going to use that to blend this here. So we're going to be working on filling in this section. So we still want these areas to be light. So try to avoid this bottom part and the top here. Fill this whole section in. Now, depending on how wet, your paper may still be wet up here, so just keep that in mind as you're working. Mine's mostly dry at this point, so hopefully yours is too. Alright, now I'm rinsing off my brush. So my brush just has water on it, and blending these sections here. So this one I got a little bit too much paint on it, so I'm going to get this wet and then grab a corner of my paper towel and try to pick some of this up. So now I've got water on my brush, and I'm just kind of scrubbing it because there was a hard line there. Okay, and I'm going to drop in some of the red, so I'm just making this section darker now. But again, you don't want it to go too far, so I'm keeping it in the middle of this section. And then I'm going to rinse off my brush. And just pick some of the paint up. Blend this section here. There's just water on my brush. We're getting close to finishing with the fox. After this, we're going to be working on making certain sections darker. So we're going to work on the face a little bit, as well as this section here and here. So we're getting close to being done with the fox. Now we're just adding some of the darker details. Right, so right now we're going to work over here. And I'm just going to grab some of the light oxide red and burnt sienna. And my paper's not wet, I'm just painting directly on the paper. And this is such a small section, I don't have to worry too much about blending. So now I'm going to grab my larger brush and just use water to fill in the rest of the space. And I need a little bit more paint because there is this sort of dotted line there. So I need to cover that up. Alright, so that section is darker. I'm going to go back to my small brush. And I'm going to grab some of the burnt umber just directly on my brush. And I'm going to be filling in this little triangle section here. So this does need to be pretty dark. I'm going to add a little bit of the gray. A little bit of the red, why not? Doesn't matter too much what colors are there as long as it is darker than the tail. Now I'm going to work on the ears. So I'm just going to grab some of the burnt umber and burnt sienna and darken this section in here, and there's not whole lot of detail in there. You just want to make sure that you get this space darker. So this is the burnt umber. And then I'm going to get some of the Payne's gray on my brush and just dot some in there, add some fur. Now I'm going to come here and we're just going to do the closed eye. So grab some of the Payne's gray on your brush, very little water, you just want it to be really dark. And do your eyelid here. I'm going to add a dark line of fur along there as well. Now this is still wet, so just be careful with that. I'm going to grab some of the gray on my brush, a little bit more water than last time, so I don't want it to be black, just dark gray. And we're going to come in here. And add some of that. I'm going to rinse my brush off. And I just want to blend this. And again, remember that this down here is still wet, so don't get that section wet. And if you go too dark, you can always pull this up with a paper towel. I'm going to grab some of the Payne's gray and do the nose. I'm leaving a couple little white spaces there, so not making it completely black. And then as soon as this is dry, you can come in and do the whiskers. And then over here, you should still have some watered down gray on your palette. If not, just add some water and add a little bit of gray. I'm gonna come in here and just add some fur. Okay, other than the whiskers, that is pretty much it for our fox, and then we're gonna work on the sky. So I'll come back and do the sky and we will be almost done. Alright, so now we're gonna work on the sky. Need to do the whiskers, so grab some paint on your brush. Make sure there's not too much water. You want it to be mostly paint. And just do a few lines. Again, holding the brush at a 90-degree angle is the easiest. And if you need to add some dark paint here, you can. I'm going to go ahead and do this. Okay, so there's our fox. So the next section is just going to be a lot of gray and blue. I'm turning it every which way because I'm trying to decide how I want to start painting this. But basically, we're going to fill this whole top section in with paint. So you want to make sure that everything here is dry before we get started. So make sure that your water is clean. I'm going to adjust the camera so you see the whole thing. And just start getting the paper wet. Now, if you have a larger brush, if you've got something like a mop brush or even just a larger size of the round brush, that will make this a lot easier. But you're basically just going to paint the whole background with water. And this is where we're going to use our salt. So when you start adding a bunch of water to paper, it tends to kind of buckle. So if you find that you're having that issue, it is easier to kind of tape it down with painter's tape. But I like to move the painting around, and I can't do that if it's taped down. So I'm not going to tape it. It may wrinkle a little bit, but I can just stick it in a heavy book later on if I want to kind of flatten it out. You don't have to go right up to the edge of the paint for the fox. We'll do that later. You just want to make sure that most of this is wet. And you can probably see it's pretty shiny. So we want a decent amount of water on this. We don't want it to dry too quickly as we're working because it's a fairly large section. Okay, now I'm just going to add a little bit of water to my palette, and this is where we're going to use the blue. So grab some of your blue and some of your gray. I'm going to test it out and see how this looks. And remember, the paper is wet, so it's not going to be as dark as it looks on here, but we want this kind of a midnight blue. And we're going to use that darker shade towards the bottom. So down here. If you find that your paper is starting to dry off, you can always get more water. And we're going to do the same on this side. You may have to mix some more paint. Okay, so we wanted our darkest paint there at the bottom. It'll get lighter as we go up. So now I'm just rinsing my brush off and spreading this. You can also add water to if you've got paint left on your palette, you can use that as well. And it doesn't have to be perfectly even, because we're going to be adding our salt, so it doesn't matter too much if it looks perfect. What we do want to make sure of is that we have a lot of water on our paper, because that will make the salt blooms a little bit more dramatic than if the paper is mostly dry. So you do have to work kind of fast. So just fill in as much as you can. The paint. Make sure you've got plenty of water. And at this point, I'm going to start adding our salt. And this is just regular table salt. Whatever the brand is that has the little girl with the umbrella. You can use chunkier salts too, but as long as your paper's wet, this works okay. So just put some in your hand. And just drop it all over, and this is going to help us help it look like it's got some snow falling down. And you can put as much or as little as you want. And even on these lighter areas, as long as your paper is pretty wet, it should show up. I'm just going to put it everywhere. Okay, and so while that is drying, I'm going to rinse my brush off, get the salt off of this section down here. And I don't want this to be completely white, so I'm going to grab some of my watered down blue-gray that I was using for the sky and just drag some of the paint down here so it looks like maybe some areas where the snow is kind of bunched up. Rinse off my brush and just do that in a few different spots. Okay, so once this is dry, all we need to do is shake the salt off and we will be finished. Alright, so our painting has dried and I've shaken off all the salt, and you can see how it affected the background. I must have used a lot more salt, either more salt or more water this time. Here's my original. It's not as dramatic, but I kind of look like this. It looks like it's a little bit more of a blizzard. So next month we're going to be back to in person, hopefully. You can check our calendar for registration. We're going to be doing some abstract art using watercolors and different types of ink and markers. So if you would like to share a photo, you can go ahead and email that to me or share it on Facebook. I would love to see it, and I will see you next time.